There are stories that the mountains swallowed whole, not because no one was paying attention, but because the people who were paying attention decided, very deliberately, that certain truths were better left underground. You have heard of famous killers. You have heard of famous crimes. You have heard the cases that made the newspapers, the ones that got the trials, the ones that got the books written about them decades later by historians who weren't there and didn't have to live near what remained. But there is another category of crime entirely. The kind that happened in places so remote and so poor and so forgotten that no one with the power to document it ever saw reason to make the journey. The kind that was investigated by men who already had their conclusion before they arrived. The kind where the victims had no families powerful enough to demand answers. Ruth Harlan of Pike County, Kentucky, belongs to that category. She was 44 years old when the truth about her property on the upper fork of Pond Creek finally came to light in the autumn of 1889. What they found beneath her smokehouse was not the end of the story. It was the part of the story that the county sealed, the newspapers buried, and the locals agreed, by unspoken compact, never to repeat to outsiders again. There were things discovered in that root cellar that the circuit court chose not to document in full, that the county physician chose not to formalize in writing, and that the one paragraph published in the Pikeville paper chose very carefully not to name. The official record of Ruth Harlan is a document engineered to minimize. What is left in letters in private journals and a surveyor's notebook donated to a state library 40 years after the fact is considerably more disturbing than anything the official record was willing to preserve. Until now, no one had assembled all of it in one place. Before we begin, drop in the comments where you are watching from and tell me what time it is there. By the time this is over, you will understand why I ask. Pike County, Kentucky in 1889 was not simply isolated. It was a world that operated by its own rules, its own calendar, and its own understanding of what justice meant and who deserved it. The Big Sandy River Valley cut deep through the mountains, and the ridgelines above it were home to families who had been there for 4 and 5 generations, people whose nearest neighbor might be 2 hours by foot, and whose nearest sheriff was a full day's ride down roads that turned to rivers of mud every November and stayed that way until April. The law was not absent from Pike County. It was theoretical, a concept that applied in Pikeville, the county seat, and grew thinner and more translucent the further you climbed from it, until up in the hollows along Pond Creek it was barely visible at all. Whatever happened up there happened without witnesses, without records, and without recourse. The geography itself was a kind of permission. It is important to understand what that meant in practical terms for a woman alone on a property like Ruth Harlan's. There was no telegraph line to Pond Creek. There was no doctor within reasonable distance. The nearest church was 6 miles down the valley. The nearest female neighbor of any kind was 2.5 miles away, across a ridge that was passable in good weather and a genuine obstacle in bad. A man could come to that property, and no one would necessarily know he had been there. No one would necessarily notice if he failed to leave. The road that passed in front of the Harlan property saw perhaps 3 or 4 travelers a week in fair weather and almost none in the cold months. For long stretches of the year, Ruth Harlan was simply invisible to the world around her, and the world around her was invisible to itself. The first frost of 1889 came early. By the 3rd week of October, the streams along the upper fork had already begun to glaze at the edges in the mornings, and the fog that settled into the low ground at night was the thick yellow kind, the kind that muffled sound and turned familiar landmarks into suggestions. Trees you had passed 100 times looked wrong in it. Distances collapsed or stretched without reason. It was the kind of autumn that made people stay close to home, close to the fire, and the hollows on either side of Pond Creek were quieter than usual, the silence broken only by the occasional crack of a dead branch in the cold and the far-off sound of water moving over limestone in the dark. Ruth Harlan had lived on her property, 40 acres of rough bottom land and steep-sided timber hill, since her second husband, Coy Harlan, had died in 1883. She was not, by the account of anyone in the community, a woman who drew attention to herself. She was lean and broad-shouldered, with a build that had come from decades of work that no one was going to do for her, hauling water, splitting wood, managing livestock through the long winters without help. Her hands told the story of her life more honestly than she ever did herself, calloused across the palms from the axe and the washboard, 2 fingers on her left hand crooked from a break that had healed without being set, the knuckles swollen and hard as river stones. Her eyes were described in the statement given to Deputy Sheriff Aldous Crane in October 1889 as pale and gray, the color of creek water in February, flat and difficult to read. She kept a kitchen garden behind the house. She kept 3 hogs and a milk cow. She sold eggs at the store in Hellier, 4 miles down the creek, every other week, arriving and departing without particular conversation. She went to church twice a year, at Christmas and Easter, and sat in the back and left before the socializing began. For 6 years after Ruth Harlan died, she gave no one a reason to think about her at all. She was known as a quiet woman who kept to herself and caused no trouble. Peculiar, some said, a loner, but not a woman who had given the community a reason to be afraid of her. The way folks always talk about solitary people they do not quite understand, but have not yet been given cause to fear. That was the most important thing about Ruth Harlan, looking back on it. She had made herself invisible in a community where no one was watching very carefully to begin with, and she had done it for a very long time before anyone thought to ask how long. The first person to disappear from Ruth Harlan's general vicinity was a peddler named Silas Combs. This is documented. The ledger kept by Norris Bates at the Hellier General Store, a ledger that now sits in the Pike County Historical Society archive in Pikeville, records that Silas Combs made a purchase of 3 pounds of salt and a paper of pins on the morning of October 14, 1889. Bates wrote in the margin beside the entry, in pencil, the single notation, "Heading up Pond Creek, Mrs. Harlan's way." Combs was a known figure on that circuit. He had traveled the Upper Pond Creek route twice a year for 7 years, selling tin goods, thread, lamp oil, and small hardware to the households, too far from Hellier to make the trip themselves. He was 51 years old, a widower from Mingo County, West Virginia. He was known to be reliable and punctual. He was expected at the home of James and Cordelia Mullins, 3 miles above the Harlan property, by nightfall on October 14th. He never arrived. His mule was found the following morning by Cordelia Mullins's eldest son, wandering the ridge road 2 miles above the Harlan property, still fully loaded with Combs's goods and canvas packs, the lead rope dragging in the frost-stiff grass. The mule was uninjured and untroubled. There was no sign of Silas Combs anywhere on the road in either direction, and no sign in the soft ground at the road's edge that he had left it by any means other than his own feet. Nobody thought too much of it at first. People disappeared in those mountains. They fell from ridges. They had strokes on the trail. They got turned around in the fog and walked into creek beds and did not walk out again. When Deputy Crane made note of the disappearance in his November record, he attributed it to misadventure and suggested that Combs had likely taken ill and wandered from the road. The mule's presence was considered unusual but not alarming. Ruth Harlan, when asked whether Combs had stopped at her property, said he had not. She had been inside all evening. She had not seen anyone on the road. Crane wrote this down and moved on. He had other things to attend to. It was November in Pike County. The roads were turning, and Silas Combs did not have a family in the county to press the matter. It might have ended there. It very nearly did. What changed everything was not a second disappearance, though there were second and third disappearances. It was a private journal, the kind that was never meant to be official, the kind that the man who wrote it filed away in a trunk and did not discuss, because what he had seen did not fit comfortably into any report he was being paid to write. In the spring of 1888, 18 months before Combs vanished, a surveyor named Walter Price had spent 3 days on the Upper Pond Creek Ridge working for the Consolidation Coal Company, which was beginning to acquire mineral rights in eastern Kentucky. Price was methodical, a former schoolteacher from Lexington who had come to survey work late in life, and who kept meticulous personal notes alongside his official documents. His official survey maps, filed with the company office in Louisville, show nothing unusual about the terrain around the Harlan property. But his personal journal, donated to the Kentucky State Library in Frankfort by his daughter in 1931, 42 years after these events, contains entries that read differently once you know what was found on that property in December 1889. On his second day on the ridge, Price noted a smell coming from the direction of Ruth Harlan's smokehouse. He described it in his journal as not consistent with the curing of pork, being sweeter and more pronounced than the normal product of a smokehouse fire, and persisting into the evening after the smoke itself had ceased. He noted further that during a preliminary survey visit the previous month, he had observed two men he did not recognize near the Harlan property. He had not seen them on his return. He wrote, "I did not ask the woman about them. I did not go closer to the smokehouse. I am not sure I wanted to know what that smell was." He filed his official survey without comment. He did not return to the upper fork of Pond Creek. His journal sat in a trunk for 42 years, and then, in October of 1889, the same October Silas Combs vanished, a second man stopped at the Hellier store asking for directions to the Harlan property. His name was recorded by Norris Bates as Thomas Wallen. He was a timber buyer from Virginia, traveling alone, looking to purchase standing timber from properties along the upper fork. Bates told him how to find the Harlan place. He mentioned that Ruth Harlan had some good timber on the hill above her bottomland and might be willing to sell. He was friendly and helpful, Norris Bates. He meant no harm by it. Thomas Wallen was never seen again. This time, there was a family. Wallen had a brother in Grundy, Virginia, who had expected him home by the first week of November. When November passed and December came, and Thomas Wallen had not returned or written, his brother George made the journey to Pike County. He presented himself at the sheriff's office in Pikeville, and he was persistent in the particular, grinding way that a man is persistent when he has ridden a long distance and does not intend to be brushed off. He had written letters in advance. He had the name of the store where his brother had last been seen and the name of the property he had been directed toward. Sheriff Bowen assigned Deputy Aldous Crane to investigate. Crane was 53 years old, a war veteran, a man who had spent 3 decades in Pike County and believed he had seen most of what human beings were capable of doing to one another. He rode up to the Harlan property on December 9, 1889, accompanied by a deputy named Enoch Yates and by George Wallen himself. Crane was a skeptical man by long habit. He had investigated disappearances before. He expected to find nothing, or to find that Wallen had taken sick on the road and been buried quietly by a neighbor up the creek. He went because it was his job to go, not because he believed he would find anything that required his full attention. He was deeply wrong about that. Ruth Harlan received them at the property. She was cooperative. She was composed. She answered every question directly and without apparent difficulty. She had not seen Thomas Wallen. She had not seen Silas Combs. She managed her property alone and received few visitors. There was nothing in her manner that a man expecting nothing would have found unusual. She showed them the house, the yard, the garden. She walked them to the edge of the property. She did not offer to show them the smokehouse. Enoch Yates asked to see it. Crane's official report describes the smokehouse as a structure of ordinary construction. It was. What the official report does not describe is what happened when Yates noticed the outline of a hatch in the floor beneath a scattering of old ash and sawdust, and what made him pull it up. A hunch, he said later, that he could not articulate and could not fully explain even to himself. He got the hatch open and lowered his lantern down into the dark below it. The smell hit them before the light reached the bottom. A thick, coppery sweetness, heavy and low, the way water sits at the bottom of a deep well on a warm day. It filled the smokehouse immediately, and Crane wrote to his wife that evening that it was a smell he had first encountered during the war and had spent 30 years working very hard to forget. Yates lowered the lantern further. Neither man said anything for a long moment. The official report, filed December 14th with the Pike County Circuit Court, describes what they found as various items of a personal nature belonging to unknown individuals. Crane's letter to his wife, Mary, preserved in a private family collection made available to researchers in 2019, used different language. He wrote, "There were bones, Mary. Too many for one man and not all of them fresh. Ruth Harlan was standing in the yard when they came out of the smokehouse. She watched Crane's face and said nothing at all. George Wallen had to be physically restrained. Crane described her expression in that same letter as one of complete stillness, not fear, not surprise, not guilt, not the way guilt usually showed itself. He wrote, "The way a stone looks when the water moves around it." She was placed under arrest and transported to Pikeville the following day. She made no statement during the arrest. She made no statement during the transport. She would make no statement at any point during the investigation, the examination, or the trial that followed. The investigation conducted in the weeks after her arrest was quiet, methodical, and, the surviving record makes this apparent, deliberately limited in what it committed to paper. Dr. Hiram Sawyer, the county physician in Pikeville, examined the material recovered from the cellar in January 1890. His official report, filed with the court, states that the remains belong to a minimum of 4 adult males. His private correspondence tells a different story. A letter to a colleague at Transylvania University in Lexington, found in that colleague's papers in the university archive, describes what Sawyer actually found with more specificity than he was willing to put in the official record. "The bones recovered from the lowest and oldest layer of the cellar," Sawyer wrote to his colleague, "showed evidence of having been in that space for considerably longer than the recent disappearances alone could account for. The layering," he wrote, "suggests deliberate accumulation over a period of years, possibly a decade or more. It is a disturbing conclusion. It is also one I was not asked to formalize in my official findings, and I have chosen to respect that judgment." No one asked him to formalize it. No one in the official inquiry looked further back than 1883, the year Ruth Harlan died. No one interviewed people who had known Ruth Harlan before she came to Pike County. No one asked publicly about her first husband, a man from Letcher County whose name appears in Pike County marriage records dated 1876, and in no surviving record of any kind after 1879. His death, if it was formally recorded at all, was recorded somewhere that no researcher working this case has yet been able to locate. The trial lasted 1 day. The charge had been reduced, for reasons the court record does not explain and no surviving correspondence clarifies, from multiple counts of murder to a single count of unlawful disposal of human remains. Ruth Harlan entered no statement. She offered no defense and no explanation. She sat in the dock with the same stillness that Crane had described in the yard on December 9th. The sentence was 12 years in the Kentucky State Penitentiary at Frankfort. She served the full term without incident. She was released in 1901. There is no record of where she went after that, what name she used, or whether she was ever in contact with anyone in Pike County again. The case was not reported in the Louisville Courier-Journal. It was not reported in the Lexington Press. A single paragraph appeared in the Pikeville paper in February 1890, describing a conviction without naming the charge, describing a sentence without naming the defendant, and concluding with the observation that the matter was now resolved and closed. It was the kind of paragraph written by someone who had been told, clearly and firmly, what the community needed this story to be. It was designed to end conversation, not to document truth. The mountain kept the rest. Today, the property on the upper fork of Pond Creek in Pike County is part of a private timber holding. The bottomland has not been farmed in over 100 years. The smokehouse is long gone. The root cellar was filled and sealed at some point in the winter of 1890, by whom and on whose authority is not recorded in any document that has survived. In 2003, a surveying crew working for a timber company found disturbed earth on the northwest corner of the lot that their equipment flagged as a subsurface anomaly. They noted it in their field report as a possible old cellar foundation. The report passed through the hands of a county planner in Pikeville who recognized the property location. He forwarded it to the County Historical Society with a brief handwritten note attached. The note said only, "You'll know what this is." The Historical Society added it to a file that had been sitting in a cabinet since the 1940s. Nobody went back out to the site. Nobody has gone since. The fog still settles into the low ground along Pond Creek every October. The same yellow fog that filled the hollows the morning Cordelia Mullins' son found a mule wandering the ridge road with its load still tied and its lead rope dragging through the frost. Here is the question this story leaves behind, and it is not a comfortable one. Ruth Harlan lived in a world that gave a 44-year-old widow almost no legal standing, no property rights independent of a husband's name, and no recourse against the men who traveled through that isolated country alone and understood implicitly that the remoteness of a place was a kind of permission. We do not know what she experienced before she came to Pond Creek. We do not know what those 2 marriages contained. We do not know the specific accumulation of events that produced a woman capable of what was found beneath her smokehouse. What we know is that she did it for years, that a court of law saw fit to charge her with something considerably less than what the evidence warranted, and that a community decided, deliberately and collectively, to make sure the story went no further than it absolutely had to. Was Ruth Harlan a monster who used the powerlessness of her position as cover for something dark that had been inside her from the beginning? A woman who chose this, who built this, who maintained it deliberately for over a decade? Or was she something else? A woman so thoroughly failed by every structure around her, legal, social, familial, that what happened on that property is, at least in part, a mirror held up to the world that shaped her. I am not asking you to excuse it. I am asking you to look at it directly. Those are not the same thing. And the answer matters, because there are more Ruth Harlans in this history than anyone has ever sat down to count. This is one of the most deliberately buried cases I have encountered in years of working through records that were never meant to surface. The mountains of eastern Kentucky are full of stories sealed before anyone outside the county could ask the right questions. Ruth Harlan is only one of them. Tell me in the comments, monster or mirror. I want to know where you land. If these buried histories are what brought you here, and you want to go further into the shadows that the official record tried to forget, subscribe and ring the bell. What is coming next goes deeper still. The mountains remember, even when the records don't.